June 8, 1944. Kempton Park Racecourse, Surrey, England. The rain fell soft and persistent as the lorries arrived carrying their cargo of defeat. 16-year-old Klaus Hoffmann stumbled down the truck ramp with hands raised, expecting bullets or clubs, or the savage revenge he'd been promised would await German soldiers in enemy hands. His Hitler Youth uniform hung loose on a frame that hunger had already begun to hollow. Around him, 43 other boys, none older than 19, most closer to 15, stood shivering in the English drizzle, their faces masks of terror barely contained. They had been told stories, that the British tortured prisoners, that Jews ran the camps and would exact biblical vengeance, that capture meant death disguised as interrogation. Klaus's hands trembled not from cold, but from certainty that these were his final moments. Then a British sergeant approached carrying something Klaus couldn't immediately comprehend, a tray of sandwiches, still warm, wrapped in clean cloth. The sergeant's voice was tired but not cruel. "Welcome to England, lads. You must be starving." In that moment, everything Klaus believed about the enemy, about the war, about the world itself, began to fracture like ice under spring sun. Context: the machinery of capture and the psychology of fear. By June 1944, Britain had become an enormous processing center for prisoners of war. Over 400,000 German POWs would eventually pass through British camps, but the influx that summer was unprecedented. Normandy had opened the floodgates. Young conscripts from Hitlerjugend divisions, fanatics who'd been handed rifles and ideology in equal measure, were being captured by the thousands. They arrived expecting martyrdom or torture, programmed by years of propaganda that painted the Allies as subhuman monsters bent on German extermination. The British military had learned lessons from the Great War about prisoner management. Brutality created resistance. Decent treatment created compliance and intelligence. The Geneva Conventions were followed not from pure altruism, but from practical psychology. Well-treated prisoners talked more, fought less, and didn't inspire their comrades to fight to the death rather than surrender. Still, the policy clashed with public sentiment. British civilians had endured the Blitz, had lost sons and fathers, had watched London burn. Many wanted vengeance, not sandwiches. Klaus Hoffmann represented a particular challenge. He'd been indoctrinated since age 10, when the Hitler Youth became mandatory in 1936. His education had been military drill disguised as physical education, racial theory presented as biology, and absolute obedience framed as virtue. His father had died at Stalingrad. His older brother was missing somewhere in the east. Klaus had volunteered for the Waffen-SS with the burning certainty that Germany fought for survival against Jewish Bolshevik forces seeking to enslave the German race. When he was captured near Caen after his unit was decimated by artillery, he'd tried to swallow the cyanide capsule they'd been issued. A Canadian corporal had knocked it from his hand, saving his life. Now Klaus stood in a processing line at Kempton Park, surrounded by boys who looked like younger versions of his dead father's photographs. They were searched efficiently, but not roughly. Their wounds were treated. Their lice-infested uniforms were exchanged for clean British battle dress marked POW in large letters. And then, impossibly, they were fed hot tea, white bread with margarine, tinned meat, and biscuits. Real food. More than Klaus had eaten in a week at the front. He ate mechanically, unable to reconcile the meal with everything he'd been taught to expect. The clash between myth and reality. The first night in the camp, Klaus couldn't sleep. The barracks were cold but weatherproof, with actual mattresses instead of mud. Guards walked perimeters but didn't enter the compounds without reason. No one had been beaten. No one had been shot. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, like a bone being reset. His bunkmate, a 17-year-old named Otto from Hamburg, whispered in the darkness, "They're fattening us up before they kill us. Like pigs." Klaus wanted to believe that. It made sense within the framework he'd been given. But doubts crept in like water through cracks. The British sergeant who'd given them sandwiches had looked exhausted, not cruel. The medic who'd dressed Klaus's shrapnel wound had worked with professional detachment, not sadistic pleasure. The camp commandant had addressed them in perfect German, explaining rules and rights under the Geneva Convention, with the boring precision of a school administrator. The propaganda officer at Klaus's training camp had shown them films. British soldiers bayoneting prisoners, Jewish partisans torturing captured Germans, American troops shooting surrendering Wehrmacht soldiers. Klaus had believed every frame. Now, sitting in a British POW camp eating 3 meals a day while his former comrades starved in foxholes across France, he faced an unbearable question. What if it had all been lies? The other prisoners reacted differently. Some, like Otto, clung desperately to Nazi ideology, interpreting every British kindness as elaborate psychological warfare. Others collapsed into apathy, their certainty shattered. A few, mostly older soldiers who'd fought in multiple campaigns, adapted quickly with the cynical pragmatism of survivors, and a handful, like Klaus, entered a twilight state of confusion where old beliefs warred with new evidence. The British were not ignorant of this psychological battlefield. Camp authorities included German-speaking officers who observed prisoner dynamics carefully. They separated the hardcore Nazis from the wavering conscripts. They allowed camp newspapers that gradually introduced facts about the war the boys had never heard: the Holocaust, the extent of German defeats, the testimony of German civilians who'd seen the concentration camps. The process was called re-education. Officially, the guards called it unfucking their heads. It was neither torture nor kindness. It was something more complex: the systematic deconstruction of a worldview through confrontation with reality. The first reversal: discovering the truth about food. 2 weeks into captivity, Klaus was assigned to kitchen duty. This was standard practice. Prisoners worked, maintaining camps, farming, even helping with British agriculture since so many British men were at war. Klaus expected slave labor, the kind he'd heard Jews endured in German camps. Instead, he found himself peeling potatoes alongside a British corporal named Davies, who sang music hall songs and complained endlessly about his wife's nagging. "She writes me 3 times a week," Davies grumbled, "telling me how hard everything is at home, as if I'm on holiday here supervising you lot." He glanced at Klaus with something approaching camaraderie. "Your English improving, boy?" Klaus nodded cautiously. He'd been studying from a grammar book the camp library provided. The existence of a library with books, German books, English books, even some American novels, had been another fracture in his certainty. What shattered him completely was what he saw in the kitchen. The food being prepared for prisoners was identical to what the British guards ate. Same rations, same quality, same portions. Klaus had assumed the initial meals were temporary, that starvation would begin soon. But week after week, the food kept coming. Not abundant. Britain itself was rationed, but consistent and adequate. The cooks weren't poisoning it. The guards weren't spitting in it. It was simply food, distributed with bureaucratic fairness. "Why?" Klaus finally asked Davies in halting English. "Why you feed us like soldiers?" Davies looked at him with genuine puzzlement. "You are soldiers, aren't you? Just happen to be on the wrong bloody side. Geneva Convention says prisoners get fed. Simple as that." But it wasn't simple. In Klaus's training, they'd been taught that the Geneva Convention was a Jewish trick to weaken German resolve, that mercy was weakness, that the enemy deserved only extermination. Yet here was Davies, a working-class British soldier who probably had every reason to hate Germans, treating Klaus like a troublesome nephew rather than a mortal enemy. That night, Klaus lay awake again, but this time, not from fear, from something more destabilizing: doubt. If the British weren't monsters, if the food was real, if the Geneva Convention actually meant something, what else had been lies? The doubt was a seed. It would grow whether Klaus wanted it to or not. Psychological reactions, the spectrum of adaptation. The camp at Lodge Moor in Sheffield became Klaus's home for the next 8 months. It held nearly 5,000 German prisoners, creating a miniature Germany behind barbed wire. Here, the psychological war intensified. The prisoners divided into factions: the true believers who held secret Nazi meetings, the pragmatists who just wanted to survive, and the growing number who began questioning everything. Klaus found himself drawn to a study group led by a former teacher named Herr Lindemann, a Wehrmacht captain captured in North Africa, who'd been a socialist before 1933. Lindemann ran classes on literature, mathematics, and history, real history, not the racial mythology Klaus had learned in school. The British authorities allowed this, even encouraged it, as part of their re-education program. "Tell me, Klaus," Lindemann asked one day, "what do you know about the Treaty of Versailles?" Klaus recited what he'd been taught: a Jewish-inspired conspiracy to destroy Germany, impossible reparations designed to cause starvation, theft of German land by inferior races. Lindemann listened patiently. Then he handed Klaus a book, the actual text of the treaty, in German and English. Read it yourself. Then we'll discuss. This became a pattern. Every Nazi claim was met not with counter-propaganda but with primary sources. Klaus read Churchill's speeches, Roosevelt's fireside chats, German newspapers from before the Nazi seizure of power. He saw photographs the British had taken of Bergen-Belsen after liberation, images so horrifying he initially refused to believe them, insisting they were fakes. Other prisoners reacted with violence to this education. 2 boys who began openly criticizing Hitler were beaten severely by hardcore Nazis. The British separated the factions, moving the fanatics to different camps. This itself was revealing to Klaus. If the British were the monsters he'd been taught to expect, why would they protect German prisoners from other German prisoners? The psychological strain was visible. Some prisoners developed psychosomatic illnesses. Others sank into depression. A few attempted suicide. The British response was medical care and psychiatry. Concepts Klaus had been taught were Jewish pseudoscience. Yet the camp doctor, a Jewish physician named Dr. Goldstein, who'd fled Germany in 1938, treated German prisoners with the same care he gave British soldiers. Klaus's worldview wasn't changing through persuasion. It was collapsing under the weight of observable reality that contradicted every article of faith he'd held. Subplot, letters from home, and the reality of defeat. In October 1944, Klaus received his first letter from home. His mother's handwriting was shaky, the paper thin and rough. She wrote carefully, knowing British censors would read every word. She told him his younger sister was alive, working in a factory. Their house had been destroyed in an air raid. Food was scarce. She didn't mention his brother, and the silence spoke volumes. The letter contained no propaganda, no exhortations to remain loyal to the Führer. Just the desperate, mundane survival of a German civilian woman trying to keep her family alive as the Reich collapsed. Reading it, Klaus realized something he'd never articulated. The war had been an abstraction to him, a grand ideological struggle. To his mother, it was simply the thing that had taken her husband and 2 sons and was now taking her home and food. Other prisoners received similar letters. The mail became a window into Germany's disintegration. Some letters spoke of Russian advances, of panic in the eastern territories, of girls as young as 14 being drafted into the Volkssturm. The fantasy of final victory, still maintained by hardline prisoners, collided with testimony from the people they'd supposedly been fighting to protect. A new prisoner arrived in November, a 18-year-old named Friedrich who'd been captured at Arnhem. He brought fresh news from the front. Germany was losing, obviously and undeniably. The Western Allies were at the German border. The Eastern Front had collapsed. V weapons hadn't changed anything. The miracle weapons promised by propaganda didn't exist. Friedrich also brought something else, a different kind of trauma. He'd been part of a unit that executed civilians in France accused of partisan activity. He spoke about it once late at night, his voice hollow. They made us shoot children, said they were terrorists. They were just children. I can still hear them. The British authorities recorded Friedrich's testimony. Not for propaganda, they didn't need German confessions for that, but for war crimes documentation. Klaus listened and felt something break inside him that could never be repaired. The realization that Germany hadn't just lost militarily, it had lost morally. The crimes were real. The atrocities had happened, and he'd been part of the system that enabled them, even if he'd never personally pulled a trigger. The warm meals suddenly tasted like ashes, not because they were inadequate, but because Klaus finally understood he didn't deserve them. Emotional weight. The burden of learning. Christmas 1944 approached with bitter irony. The British authorities allowed the German prisoners to celebrate, providing materials for decorations and organizing a special meal. The camp choir, composed of former professional musicians, rehearsed German Christmas carols. Klaus participated mechanically, singing songs his mother had taught him when the world made sense. On Christmas Eve, a British chaplain visited the camp. Father Thompson was a Catholic priest who spoke fluent German, having studied in Munich before the war. He held an optional service that Klaus attended more from boredom than faith. Thompson's sermon avoided politics entirely, focusing instead on the theological concept of mercy, undeserved grace given freely. After the service, Klaus approached Thompson. "Father, how can you show mercy to us? We're your enemies, we've killed your countrymen." Thompson looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "You're not my enemy, son. You're a boy wearing an enemy's uniform. There's a difference, and mercy isn't a reward for virtue. It's a gift given precisely to those who don't deserve it. Like you, like me, like all of us. But we've done terrible things. Yes, Thompson agreed without hesitation. Your country has committed acts that will stain history for centuries. Some of you personally participated. Some of you simply looked away. Both are forms of guilt. But guilt acknowledged is the first step toward redemption. Guilt denied is just evil with a clean conscience. Klaus wanted to argue, to defend Germany, to claim ignorance. But the words wouldn't come. He'd seen too much now, read too much, heard too much testimony from fellow prisoners who confessed their sins in the darkness. He couldn't claim ignorance anymore. That night Klaus wrote a letter to his mother. He told her things he knew the censors would read, things he knew she might not understand, that he was alive and safe, that he was learning English, and that he was beginning to understand how wrong everything had been. He didn't expect her to agree. He simply needed to say it. The letter came back 3 months later, stamped, address unknown, area destroyed. His mother's fate remained unknown until after the war, when he learned she'd died during the Soviet siege of Berlin. The guilt of that, being safe and fed while his mother starved, would haunt Klaus for the rest of his life. Escalation, VE Day, and the collapse of certainty. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. Klaus heard the news from British guards who celebrated with restrained joy, relief more than triumph. In the German compound, reactions split sharply. Some prisoners celebrated quietly, grateful the killing had stopped. Others sank into despair, mourning the death of everything they'd believed. A small group of fanatics insisted it was temporary, that secret weapons would still win the war, that the Führer had a plan. Then came the newsreels. The British authorities showed films of Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. They forced every prisoner to watch, sitting in a requisitioned cinema, while British cameramen documented their reactions. Klaus sat in the 4th row as images appeared on screen. Skeletal corpses stacked like cordwood, mass graves, survivors who looked more like ghosts than humans, German civilians being forced to bury the dead by Allied troops. Some prisoners looked away, some vomited, some wept. Klaus sat frozen, unable to process the scale of what he was seeing. The narrator spoke in clinical English, translated by a German-speaking officer. These camps were liberated by British and American forces in April 1945. The German SS guards fled or destroyed evidence. These are not propaganda. These are documentary records. After the film, a survivor spoke, a Polish Jew named Samuel Lieberman, who'd been liberated from Auschwitz. He was 31 but looked 60, his arm tattooed with numbers. He spoke in German, his voice devoid of emotion, as if feeling anything would break him. I was a teacher before the war. I taught mathematics in Warsaw. Your people killed my wife, my daughter, my parents, my 3 brothers, and 287 of my former students. I am here not to accuse you personally, but to bear witness. You cannot say you did not know. Now you know. What you do with that knowledge defines whether you remain Nazis or become human beings again. The silence afterward was absolute. Klaus felt something fundamental die inside him. Not hope or faith, because those were already gone. Something simpler. The last possibility of innocence. He'd been 16 when captured, a child soldier shaped by forces beyond his control. He was 19 now, and the question that would define the rest of his life was crystallizing. How do you live after learning you were on the wrong side of absolute evil? Convergence, the alliance of broken certainties. In the months after VE Day, the British began sorting prisoners for repatriation. Germany was destroyed, divided among the Allies, and no longer capable of absorbing millions of POWs immediately. Many prisoners were put to work in Britain, farming, rebuilding bomb-damaged cities, clearing debris. Klaus was assigned to a work detail in Yorkshire, helping repair a railway line damaged by V1 attacks. He worked alongside British civilians who'd lost family in the war. The potential for violence was obvious. Instead, Klaus found something unexpected. People too exhausted by grief to sustain hatred. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman whose son had died at Dunkirk, brought tea to the work detail. Mr. Patterson, who'd lost a leg at El Alamein, supervised with gruff fairness. They didn't forgive. They simply coexisted because revenge would cost energy nobody had left. Klaus met another prisoner on the work detail, a 23-year-old named Johann who'd been a sergeant in the Afrika Korps. Johann had spent 3 years in British captivity and spoke English fluently. He'd become what the British called a white prisoner, fully cooperative, re-educated, trusted with responsibility. Johann mentored Klaus through the practical challenges of post-war existence. "You're feeling guilty," Johann observed one day while they laid railway ties. "Good. Guilt means your conscience works. The ones who never feel guilty are the real Nazis." "But I didn't personally do anything," Klaus protested. "I never shot civilians. I never even fired my rifle in combat before being captured." Johann stopped working and looked at him with sad wisdom. "You wore the uniform. You believed the ideology, at least until you were captured. You would have fought and killed if given the chance. Ignorance and youth are explanations, Klaus, not excuses. The question isn't whether you're guilty. You are, we all are, by association and complicity. The question is what you do now. What can I do? Live differently. Learn. Remember. When we finally go home, Germany will need people who understand what happened and why it can never happen again. The Nazis tried to build a 1,000-year Reich. We'll spend 1,000 years explaining what went wrong." This conversation marked a turning point. Klaus stopped trying to minimize his complicity and started trying to understand it. The shift was subtle but profound. From defensive justification to painful self-examination, preparation for the denouement, the decision to remain. By late 1946, repatriation had begun in earnest. Prisoners deemed denazified were returned to Germany in stages, sorted by region and political reliability. Klaus was scheduled for return in January 1947. The prospect filled him with dread rather than joy. Germany was a ruin, physically destroyed, morally bankrupt, occupied by foreign armies. His hometown was in the Soviet zone. His mother was dead. His brother had never been found and was presumed killed in the east. What was he returning to? The British authorities offered an alternative. Some prisoners could apply to remain in Britain as indentured laborers. The program was controversial. British workers feared German competition for scarce jobs, but practical necessity overrode sentiment. Britain needed reconstruction labor. The conditions were clear: remain under supervision, work assigned jobs for minimal pay, earn the right to permanent residency through years of reliability. Klaus applied. The decision felt like betrayal, abandoning Germany when it needed rebuilding most. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't face living in the society that had produced the Holocaust. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He needed time and distance to become someone other than the fanatical boy who'd volunteered for the SS. His application was approved in November 1946. He was assigned to a farm in Lincolnshire, working for a family named the Robertsons. They had lost their son at Normandy but needed help maintaining their farm. The arrangement was awkward initially. Klaus sleeping in a converted barn, eating separate from the family, speaking little due to language barriers and mutual discomfort. But necessity forged connection. When Klaus saved a calf during a difficult birth, Mr. Robertson shook his hand. When he repaired a broken tractor using mechanical skills learned in Hitler Youth training, Mrs. Robertson invited him to eat meals with the family. Their surviving daughter, Elizabeth, began teaching him better English using children's books. Slowly, incrementally, Klaus became part of their rhythm. He wrote to Johann, who'd already been repatriated to Bremen, describing this strange new existence. Johann's reply was blunt. "You're being given something most Germans will never have, a chance to start over without the weight of visible ruins reminding you daily what we did. Don't waste it. Become the person you would have been if Germany had remained decent. That's the only redemption possible." Direct confrontation, facing the past in present tense. The confrontation came unexpectedly in spring 1947. A group of Jewish refugees, survivors of concentration camps, were being temporarily housed in a nearby facility while awaiting immigration permits to Palestine or America. Some worked temporary jobs in the area. Klaus encountered one, a man named David Rosenberg, at the village market. Rosenberg saw Klaus's POW identification card when he fumbled paying for supplies. The temperature in the conversation dropped instantly. "You're German," Rosenberg said in accented English. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Klaus admitted, unable to lie or evade. "Wehrmacht? SS?" Klaus felt his face burn with shame. "Waffen-SS? I was conscripted at 16, captured at 17 in Normandy. I never what?" Rosenberg interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Never killed anyone? Never believed the propaganda? Never would have continued if you hadn't been captured. Klaus couldn't answer because he didn't know the answers. Would he have continued fighting? Would he have participated in atrocities if ordered? The hypothetical innocence of actions never taken felt meaningless facing a man whose suffering was absolute fact. I was at Mauthausen, Rosenberg said quietly. 3 years. They worked us until we died, then replaced us with fresh Jews from Hungary or Poland or wherever the trains delivered them. I survived because I'm a watchmaker. They needed skilled workers. Everyone I knew died. My wife, my children, my parents, my 7 brothers and sisters. 32 members of my extended family, dead because people wearing your uniform believed Jews were subhuman. Klaus stood silently, groceries forgotten. What could he say? I'm sorry, was inadequate to obscenity. I didn't know was now a lie. I was just a child sounded like excuse masquerading as explanation. Finally, Rosenberg spoke again. I don't want your apology. I don't want your guilt. I want you to remember. Every day of your life, remember what your people did. Remember so completely that you become incapable of forgetting, and then live in a way that makes that memory mean something. Can you do that? Klaus nodded, unable to speak past the constriction in his throat. Then we have nothing more to discuss. Rosenberg turned and walked away, leaving Klaus standing in the market square, carrying a burden he would never be able to set down. The Apex, Understanding Humanity's Fragility. December 1947. Klaus had been in Britain for over 3 years. He was no longer a prisoner but not yet fully free. His status was supervised resident alien, a bureaucratic category that meant freedom with an asterisk. He'd saved enough money to rent a small room in the village, no longer living on the Robertson farm but still working there daily. One evening, Mr. Robertson invited Klaus to the village pub, a gesture of acceptance that carried enormous social weight. Over warm beer that Klaus had learned to tolerate if not enjoy, Robertson asked the question that had hung unspoken between them for months. Why'd you lot do it? The camps, the killings, all of it. You're not monsters, most of you. So how did it happen? Klaus had spent hundreds of hours contemplating this question. His answer came slowly, painfully. We were taught that some people weren't really people, that Germany was under existential threat, that extreme measures were necessary for survival. And we believed it because everyone around us believed it, because questioning meant being labeled a traitor, because the alternative was admitting our leaders were evil and we were fools for following them. But you knew murder was wrong. We weren't told it was murder. We were told it was self-defense, elimination of threats, necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The words we used made it sound like something other than what it was. Klaus paused, struggling for honesty. And I think many of us didn't want to know the full truth. Knowing would have required action. Not knowing let us remain comfortable. Robertson drank his beer thoughtfully. We did terrible things too, you know. Dresden, the firebombing raids. We killed civilians by the thousands. The difference, I suppose, is we never built factories specifically designed to exterminate entire categories of people. There's conventional war crimes, and then there's what you lot did. That's something beyond war. That's something that scares me because it means humans are capable of making evil systematic and efficient. Yes, Klaus agreed quietly. That's exactly what scares me too. Because if we could do it, ordinary people, not demons, then anyone could. Under the right circumstances, with the right propaganda, sufficient fear, any nation could become what we became. The recognition of that universal fragility was more terrifying than any specific German culpability. It meant the Holocaust wasn't an aberration, but a possibility permanently embedded in human nature. The moral and historical revelation, the cost of redemption. May 1948. Klaus received notification that his supervised status would be reviewed for possible lifting. If approved, he could become a permanent resident with freedom of movement, the right to change employment, and a path to eventual naturalization. The interview would assess his denazification, his behavior during captivity and supervised residency, and his understanding of German crimes. The interview took place in a government office in London. 3 officials, a Home Office administrator, a military intelligence officer, and a Jewish community representative, questioned Klaus for 2 hours. They asked about his ideology, his actions during the war, his current beliefs, his understanding of the Holocaust. The Jewish representative, a woman named Ruth Stein, asked the hardest question. Do you believe you've been punished appropriately for your role in German crimes? Klaus considered this carefully. No, he said finally. I haven't been punished at all. I was captured, fed, housed, educated, and given opportunities. My punishment, if you can call it that, is knowledge, understanding what I was part of, and living with that understanding. But compared to what your people suffered, compared to what German civilians endured, compared to what my victims, and yes, I have to count myself as having victims even if I personally didn't kill anyone, compared to what they experienced, I've been treated with incomprehensible mercy. And what do you owe for that mercy? Stein pressed. Everything, Klaus said simply. I owe a life lived in opposition to everything I once believed. I owe memory that doesn't fade. I owe testimony that doesn't equivocate. I owe work toward ensuring it never happens again. And I owe the humility to know that none of that is enough. It will never be enough. There is no redemption from complicity and genocide. There's only the choice to live differently going forward. Stein looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a notation on her paperwork. Approved, she said quietly. Klaus's status was changed to permanent resident 3 weeks later. He remained in Britain for the rest of his life, eventually becoming a teacher who specialized in modern history. Every year, he spoke to students about the war, about propaganda, about the ease with which ordinary people can be made to serve evil. He never claimed to be a hero. He only claimed to be a cautionary tale. Klaus Hoffmann died in Yorkshire in 2003 at age 76. His obituary in the local paper described him as a beloved teacher, a fixture of the community, and a tireless advocate for Holocaust education. It mentioned his German origins almost as an afterthought, more interesting biographical detail than defining characteristic. He'd become thoroughly British while remaining perpetually German, living in the tension between those identities for 58 years. At his funeral, his former students spoke of a gentleman who taught history as moral lesson rather than memorized dates. Elizabeth Robertson, now Elizabeth Hoffmann, she'd married Klaus in 1952 in a controversial ceremony that scandalized some and inspired others, remembered the frightened boy who'd arrived expecting punishment and found humanity instead. He never forgot where he came from, she said, but he also never let it excuse who he'd been. That balance, between understanding context and accepting responsibility, was how he lived. Among his papers, his children found hundreds of letters exchanged with other former prisoners over the decades. Many had returned to Germany, rebuilt lives, raised families, and struggled like Klaus with the weight of their past. Some achieved peace, others never did. The letters formed a collective meditation on guilt, mercy, and the possibility of redemption from unforgivable participation. The British treatment of German POWs wasn't uniformly merciful. There were abuses, failures, moments where guards let hatred override policy. But the systematic decision to treat prisoners with basic humanity, to provide food and shelter and re-education rather than vengeance, represented something profound. The choice to remain civilized when civilization itself had nearly collapsed. That choice cost British taxpayers money and emotional labor at a time when both were scarce. The return on that investment was measured not in grateful prisoners but in men like Klaus, who became living antibodies against fascism, carrying testimony about what they'd been and what they'd learned into the post-war world. War reveals who we are when everything else is stripped away, Klaus wrote in his final journal entry, months before his death. Defeat revealed who we Germans had become, capable of industrialized evil. Captivity revealed who the British chose to be, capable of systematic mercy. Both revelations were necessary. If this story makes you reflect on the fragility of decency and the power of unexpected grace, share it. Because what we remember about our capacity for both evil and kindness determines what we become next.